I think people have been traditionally expecting a very straight line of a career and a life. If I do
Yeah.
this, then this happens, then this happens, and eventually I'm going to get there. There's a destination.
Hmm.
There's no destination anymore. And I think people have made some traditional choices for themselves to
Hmm.
take a bigger job, to achieve at all costs, to maybe delay having a family or whatever the case may be. And they're feeling like they are lost. Like there's a feeling of not being fulfilled, not feeling happy, wondering if there's more. Like, is this it? I mean, think about how rich our life still is with everything happening, and people are feeling bored and not on purpose. There's
Hmm.
an emptiness that I see.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are listening to and/or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, a podcast that I do first live stream on Facebook, then it goes to YouTube, then to all the places podcasts go to. And today I am talking with an author and life leadership coach, Susan Ross. She has a children's book called Welcome to Planet Positive. But today, I think I want to talk more about what she founded, which is a coaching company called Intention Personal Development Group. Susan, I met you sort of briefly when you went to an event that I did in the New York area, talking about a book I did called Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, which
Yep.
you've got sitting there. Thank you very much. And that project was one that I worked on for 6 years, and it had a lot to do with talking with parents about the fact that a lot of us have found ourselves torn between work and life and the balance therein. I think this is probably something you run into when you do your Intention Personal Development Group. So the first thing I want to ask you there is this, and that is in the context of the last few years, which has been going through COVID and all the rest of that. Before we dive into who you are and what you do, a question that I wanted to ask was, how have you seen things change in terms of the kind of questions people are asking you, the kind of things that you're coaching people about, and what you are working on and getting folks through or helping them go through? Is it business as usual? Was there a big change for you during the COVID stay-at-home time? How are you working on your own work-life balance, as it were, in terms of just who you are as a person? Let's start there, and then let's.
You are singing my song, Frank.
And what you do. So
it
I've given
all
you enough to
wraps
chew on for a
together.
while.
You really
Go
have.
ahead.
I have plenty to chew on.
Yeah.
So I would say, first of all, I'm living that story, which is how I got into the role that I got into. But we'll save that. We'll table that for a minute. I would say I think people are definitely coming to me with things that are more of the heart and more simple. Things like you said, work-life balance, how they lead with empathy and compassion, how they can hold space for their team and what's happening with people on their team and their own lives and their own families, and all the noise and chaos that sort of get in the way of high performance and great relationships at work, which is usually your own inner self, right? It's sometimes your own saboteurs and narratives that are getting in the way. But I think that people have been in the grip. I think people are living very much in, like stress mode, if you will, as opposed to like thriving. And I think that just takes a toll, right? They're managing a lot. Everything's coming together. People aren't crossing over that barrier of work and home. They're living, at work, basically, as you well know. Right. And so I think that just creates a lot of stress, and it's harder to reach your own sense of inner balance.
Speaking of which, do you work out of your residence a lot, or do you meet with people face to face, or are you doing it all on Zoom?
I do it all on Zoom, and believe it or not, I was doing it on Zoom even before the pandemic. So sort of interesting that I just folded right into that. But yes, I am from home. I used to work at my 6-year-old's train table when I first, was stuck home. And now I've actually built an office for myself, but it's a whole new ballgame. Yeah, I am from home.
Let me back up just a second and do the introduction the way you're supposed to. When you look up who you are, your MA is in organizational psychology, if I have that right. What is organizational psychology?
That's a good question. It's what I haven't thought of in a really long time. Organizational psychology is really just the psychology and health of how people are functioning in an organization. There's not so much to say on that, except I think there's a lot of depth in the way people show up as themselves or not, like at work and in their lives. And so organizational psychology was sort of a fun veering off for me. It's a lot of leadership studies, and I would say I'm a studier of leadership. So and that's basically a large part of what I do now.
Yeah, you're doing a kind of a life coaching thing now with individuals, but when it gets to the organizational psychology, is that something more where you would work with people at the corporate level in terms of how they're putting their corporations together as they relate to their personnel, or how would you actually use that?
Well, that's a really good question. I wonder whether I have used it. To be honest with you, organizational psychology was a really fun master's degree. I did it because I wanted the branding of a great school, and I wanted to set myself apart, as some people do. And I say that freely because it seems like you're out there in the world catching people on that, like doing the traditional thing. Do I really use it? Not exactly. I was already in HR. I already had a great job. So for me, it was more learning about different leadership theories and really just getting into the philosophy of leadership. Right before I got that degree, I was at a law firm that was one of the top 10 law firms when I joined, and was not even on the top 100 list by the time I left. And so that presiding partner and leader took a law firm that was 150 years old, and through lack of great leadership, it folded. And so that's really what got me interested in doing that degree. And I wanted to do the thing. So I did the thing, and it was great fun, but I wouldn't say I'm practicing that every day or using that every day. I think it's a little more just, sort of overarching thought.
Well, I didn't know that story about the law firm you were in. And I have to ask you, because it brings up such an interesting topic, a kind of a negative imagery that also impacts what good leadership is. Just give me a thumbnail of that story, not in terms of being specific or naming names, but just tell me what are the things that take down a 150-year-old law firm that quickly? Yeah. I mean, what were the kind of mistakes? What were the mistakes being made we can learn from?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I can say the name of the firm because it's no longer with us. Someone should do a Harvard, business review case on them. So it was Couder Brothers. Okay. And it had the first license to practice in China. It was truly one of the first international firms. I know it's funny to say that now everything's international, but it wasn't at the time.
Sure.
And the partner at the time was merging with other firms around the world so quickly that I think the New York office lost its power, if you will, because that's where its main office was. And so people it just got too big too quickly, maybe a little bit of greed there. And so I think it didn't have that just nexus of tradition in the way it managed itself, and it sort of became something it didn't know who it was anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Now, let me go to a bigger subject that I planned to discuss with you. That was an unplanned question.
I have things to discuss with you, too.
One I wanted to talk with you about. The meeting that we were at together was pulled together by my friend Jose Zelstra and some other folks who work with various groups. She has one called Gender Fair, which rates corporations based on their fairness when it comes to issues of gender and inclusion, as well as the Women's Business Collaborative that she works with Edie Fraser and others, which brings up a point, because when you're talking about HR and Intention Personal Development Group and your background in organizational psychology, and you are a woman and you're working in an environment that I think sometimes the business environment tries not to be political, in that they don't want to lose clients who maybe voted for somebody they didn't vote for or whatever it might be. But I don't think at this point in American history, given the reversal of Roe v. Wade and also a whole bunch of other issues that have come along politically that impact women, gender equity, and all sorts of other things, if there's any way to kind of pretend all that's not going on in the context of whatever you or anybody else related to the business community does. So my question, and take this anywhere you want, is how have things changed for you in a climate which a lot of women are reading as hostile to women in general, and to women who are trying to have careers and families at the same time as well? You take that wherever you want. I don't want
I'm going to take it.
There's a loaded question, but I'm interested.
No, that's okay. I mean,
the context in which you're working is not neutral.
That is fair. Although I will say my life changed to be way more positive when I left the quote unquote corporate world. And I have nothing, like I said, I love the corporate world, right? I'm working with the corporate world, but I'm not in it anymore. By the way, Jose is also a friend, and I brought her into MasterCard to do a variety of gender fair work with the CEO and the CMO who I was working for at the time. So I know all about like her plight, and that was a lot of great fun. MasterCard, sometimes when you get into an organization of a certain size, was beautifully fair to its employees. And Ajay Banga was the CEO at the time, Indian man. He made sure that diversity was really paramount. And I will also say, to MasterCard's credit, I had a tremendous amount of flexibility. They let me do everything I possibly wanted to. I did flex time. I did working only 4 days. I did working 5 days and 1 from home. I took 1 summer off, and then I took a second summer off. My husband was like, "Are you just going to do this year after year?" But that was my currency for staying in a job where I was working, 12 hours a day. I loved what I did, but trying to have a family.
Yeah. And so, speaking of which, at that time, who was the family in terms of ages of children and all the rest of it? Just fill us in.
Well, that's a great, yes, absolutely. So I really grew up at MasterCard. When I first started, I had 2 dogs and a fiance. And when I left, I had a house, and I had, still the 2 dogs. I had a husband. I had 3 boys, James, Charlie, and George. George
was then how old at that time?
At that time, I probably only, so I count my life in children. This happens sometimes. So I think I only had James and Charlie. So James was probably about 5 and Charlie was about 3. And, I had one executive say to me, "You're always pregnant." You can't say that anymore, but it was always true. And because by the time you're actually, and I did a tremendous amount of fertility treatments. So the road of being pregnant, getting pregnant, being out on maternity leave, getting back into the swing was a very long process. It really did feel like it took, the spread of my boys was 5 years, but if I add on the fertility, probably 7 years. So half the time
during that time, you felt, in the corporate context you happened to be in, you felt supported rather than denigrated and or held back because of that. It sounds like you had some support.
I did feel supported. I got the opportunity. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand came to MasterCard. I got the opportunity to speak on behalf of the company about our leave policy and how strong it was and what that meant for me. So I did feel like I was supported at a company level. There were moments where towards the end, I worked for some people who didn't share those same values, right? Because in order for a value of a company to really take shape, when rubber meets the road, you've got to be able to take the flexibility or have that support. I did find, this is an odd one, that at some point, some of the top female leadership who didn't have kids were not as supportive. And that's disappointing to me, but that was just what I encountered. Sure. And so it made it a little bit more difficult for me. But that was my own, battle, if you will. I loved what I did at work. I've always loved work. But over time, I had a growing voice in me that said, I'm suffocated by these 4 walls. I just can't do this in this way anymore, which is a very hard thing when you're very loyal, so I know people are bopping around now. I was with MasterCard for 15 years and I was at the law firm, stint for 7 before that. So I would have stayed forever. But for this voice, as I would have the boys, it would be very hard for me to leave them and go back to work. And so I did it, fairly seamlessly the first time. The second time was harder, but I did it. The third time I thought, this is going to kill me. So at some point I realized I was dragging my life behind me, and I really wanted my work to blend into my life, not the other way around.
Let me ask you a question, go back to something you said a minute, and then if you've got more to say on this, please continue. But before I forget to ask you this, when you were talking about the kind of less sympathetic approach and support or lack of support that you were getting from some women, it seems to me that, something that I've written and thought about in terms of my own support of the feminist movement is that, unfortunately, one of the things that came out of the 1970s in particular was this idea that it was a kind of an either or choice. Either a woman was serious about her career or she could be, embracing having a family. And though very few people stood up and actually said this, there was an element within certain feminist writers that seemed to favor that choice very much in the direction of career, as if somehow it was either or, without taking into account two things. First of all, we all have various stages of our lives. I don't know how old your sons are now. How old are they now?
My oldest is 12. I was an old mom. I am an old mom, Frank. My oldest is 12. Right. My middle guy is 9. And then George, my youngest, is 7.
Right. Well, as you know, the stage of very early childhood goes by very quickly. And of course, to tell women or men or parents of any kind that somehow the decision they make to become a parent is the first day of the rest of their lives doesn't take into account that actually childhood moves very quickly. So it's rather a shame, because with the actuarial table showing that we all live longer, or most of us do, than past generations, you really more now than ever have time for space for children and career. And it's not an either or decision. But I'm just wondering, in your own view, you must have done some thinking about why some of the women you were working for were less sympathetic than you might have expected. Did you think it was an ideological thing, or just personality, or what? Or did you ever think about that? Because I always, I would wonder about that.
Yes. And it's going to sound like I'm making some assumptions here. So I want to put that out, right? As a coach, I try to call people on their assumptions. But the assumption that I made in a lot of the cases is that these women perhaps wanted to have children. A lot of people want to have kids and can't, right?
Yes.
And it's not that they necessarily couldn't. Maybe they decided not to, but you never know someone's story. Yeah. And there's this idea that, like, oh, if you have a full-time job and you have kids at home, like, oh, it's so great, it's so easy, you have everything. And that's not exactly true. But I felt like there was, this feeling of this frame that I use. And what is the name of the book? Anatomy of Peace has this idea that you could walk around, no matter how you behave, with a heart of war or a heart of peace. And I felt like some of these women had a little bit of a heart of war, almost like operating from a place of hurt, or I don't want to say jealousy, that's too strong, but feeling like, well, they didn't have it all, so they were going to make sure that they were on this side of the line. If they're not going to have a family, they're going to work, they're going to go 100 miles an hour, and they're going to expect you to do the same. Almost like, hey, keep up with me. You think you have it all. Like, I do all of this, why can't you, type of attitude, which is fine. But things like, sending 100 emails on a Saturday morning, if someone's with a family and working till 11 o'clock the night before, makes no sense to me. Like that, that was crossing a line to me, that sort of thing. And I would say this is more the, exception than the rule in terms of what I encountered at MasterCard, but it was an interesting bubble of some women who did not have kids, who felt just less empathetic overall. I do think there's an empathy, connection there.
Yeah. And maybe some of what one hears from people who are working in that field. I know my daughter is a CEO of a company in New York City, a financial company that does green energy stuff. And she's saying people are often surprised that she, for instance, folds into her resume her experience as a parent, as if somehow these two worlds, professional and parental or relationships, are separate. And of course, she feels very differently than that, and thinks that the two things actually have to march forward together in some kind of balance, but also openly favoring, the human relationships over and above simply just the business. So, and I think that there is a branch of thinking, both male and female, non-binary, doesn't matter, but that is so oriented toward corporate profit and what the shareholder wants and so forth, but also this idea that somehow that a woman who's serious about business has got to almost hide her interest in having a child or a family, as if somehow that makes her less serious. This is definitely a thing that my daughter has run into. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but she's certainly experienced that.
I have some friends in, I think industry, maybe it might differ in certain industries. I do have some friends in, television and production, and they feel like that's a real, serious thing where you are expected to, by the time you're 50, you're considered old, you're,
yes, right.
So you better work and not have kids until that time.
Yeah.
In certain industries, I think are worse than others, but I just think generally speaking, I don't know, I still feel very hopeful that on balance, that's not an acceptable way to be anymore. Yeah. It's frowned upon. Like, you're not going to get the best and brightest talent, because I think people from this generation do want it all, and they have
want
a
more
sense
balance.
Of purpose.
That's for sure. Let me ask you, when you do the counseling or the work you do, describe the kind of work that Intention Personal Development Group does, that you're doing on Zoom, one-on-one, or whatever it may be. Talk about your work day as it now stands when you are talking to people, and what sort of questions you're answering, but also how you're trying to guide people, not through just these issues we've been discussing, but describe what you do a little bit.
So I would say, that's a big question. So I would say, like, most simply put, I really help people to step more into their leadership, whether that be at home or at work. I think it has application in both. And part of that means becoming more of who they actually are. I say living from a sense of purpose, because I think purpose is living inside out as opposed to outside in. That's kind of why I made my own transition. I was living outside in, and I was really good at that. What does everybody want of me? How do I make these executives happy? I was so good at that. In HR, that's the expectation. And I think a lot of people find themselves there. They've been saying, oh, what does the world want of me for so long, that they don't know what they want anymore. So sometimes it's double clicking on someone's personal agenda, right? They've been so busy pleasing everyone else, they're not really sure what they want. People come with a variety of, personal hangups. It could be they're not feeling as confident in their work, right? They don't know why. They're not feeling confident as a person. A lot of fulfillment issues. They're not feeling fulfilled. They're not happy. They feel like they could be happier. Or it could be something as simple as, they're in a leadership role, but they need to move to a bigger leadership role. So how do they really step into that in a different way? They want to see themselves differently. And I think your, inner game, the way you think about yourself in the world, is fundamental to your behavior, to your outer game. So I'm really thinking more with them on why and how, not necessarily what they're doing. So the type of coach I am is called a coactive coach. Coactive is this fun, almost made up word for co is like being, a being state, and active is doing. So it's being, in relationship together and looking at, who someone is in the world and what they're doing. On your own, we kind of just look at the what, like, what am I doing next? Like checking that box. This is more of a step back of who am I? Who do I want to be? And how do I want to serve? Right? What is my purpose? Those sorts of questions.
And what sort of people are your clients, and what's the context? Are you working with them simply as individuals, or are you working with a company and they're sending you individuals?
Both. So I have like 3 different kinds of clients, or I just classify them in different ways. One is a life coaching, which is the context is life. There's no professional context in that moment. The second it's my made up word. It's called personal development, right there in my name, which is someone has a work context, but they want to drive the agenda. So they are paying personally.
I see.
And then the last is corporate coaching, which is your traditional, and I have all 3, a company contacts you and says, hey, can you work with such and such leader? But they're paying for it, which, slightly shifts the agenda, not tremendously, but somewhat. So I have those 3. I would say I mostly have personal development clients. I have a lot of those, which is great. I love that work. And I want to step even more into the corporate side now that I'm finding a little more space and time in my own schedule.
Well, maybe this is the wrong way to phrase the question, but I'm always intrigued. What are the sort of problems you're helping them work through? And maybe problems is the wrong word. what sort of possibilities you're opening up for them, but what is the typical trajectory of, to be a little bit facetious, the old Woody Allen gag that he always repeated about having been in analysis for 15 years.
Right.
How long do you help somebody for? How long does it take? And in the best of all worlds, are you moving someone from waking up wanting to be a serial killer to being a decent person? I mean, what's obvious, or is it just someone who's low self-esteem to a better place? I don't want to be too jokey about it, but I
get it
about this.
Listen, we're not working together for 15 years. However, well, each person is different, right? So each, I would say each agenda is going to be very personal to someone, but the difference so coaching is not therapy and it's not consulting. Right. So this is a funny old, little tale is if you were let's say you came to me and said, Susan, I want to learn how to ride a bike. And I was a consultant. I would say, okay, Frank, I'm going to do all of this best practice work and give you this beautiful Bella bound, color copy on best ways to ride a bike. And then our work is done. And if I were a therapist and you came and said that, I would say, okay, Frank, we're going to talk about every time you've ever ridden a bike in the past, and then you're going to know how to ride it. And as a coach, I say, you're going to start riding the bike and I'm going to walk next to you until you're riding it. So in that way, it's a present practice with an eye towards the future. So the idea is taking a client through, everyone comes with a smaller agenda, like, hey, this is wrong. I'm not getting along with my direct reports, or it's a small thing, but really there's also a bigger unsaid thing, right? Of who they want to be in the world that's different. So we think about what the vision is of what they want for themselves, right? And I help them grow that vision over time. So it's their fulfillment. Who do they really want to be? What's their real growth edge? And then we sort of think about it in terms of the choices they're making along the way. Is that in alignment with that vision, right? If someone wants to be a great leader, but they're so sharp-elbowed at work that they're pissing everyone off and they think everyone they're working with is stupid because they're maybe not as smart as them, and that sets them off. That's a real case. That's not going to serve them. So it's how are their choices and their behaviors and their thoughts in alignment with who they want to be? And then the last is the idea of processing things out loud. And this kind of goes to your initial point about being in COVID. People come to me so heavy because they're just under the weight of the world. As you start talking about these things in an environment where someone's not judging you, and it's just creative conversation, it's curiosity. So I try to get people out of judging themselves. People are always beating themselves up all the time. I do the same thing. But as we work on, thinking differently and being differently in that space, and they get a chance to really let that go, they practice new things. And so you've heard that term neuroplasticity. You can actually change your brain. And so when people are in a space where they're not feeling judged, they get to be more creative in how they think about themselves. They get to practice new ways of positive, self-talk, as opposed to all those limiting beliefs. And something shifts. It's kind of magical. Everybody wants an agenda and to know exactly what's going to happen. And then at the end, they laugh and say, how could I ever have wanted that? It's really a magic and an art to it. I usually see someone for 6 months. So that's the initial agreement. So it's twice a month for 6 months, every other week. And I would say 95% of my clients keep going. Some I've been with for 3 years. 1 hour, just like a Frank Schaeffer session. See, we're already done with our first one. But it's sustaining a different way of being and thinking over time. And clients have some work here and there, in between sessions. They actually say the best coaching happens in between, because the client's thinking about it and thinking, oh, okay, well, instead of responding this way, I might try, something else, right? And so, I can give you some examples, but you know what I mean? They're playing with their own behavior patterns.
I'm gonna reintroduce you here. Let folks know once again, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast, and it's also a live stream on Facebook. It goes to YouTube, etc. If you like this, please share it and like it in the online sense. I'm talking to author and life leadership coach Susan Ross. She's the author of a book, which I want to get to in a minute because it ties to what you were saying, called Welcome to Planet Positive. My question for you was that Welcome to Planet Positive, I guess, is a children's book. Do you happen to have a copy there? Hold it up. Show us the
You bet
cover.
I do. I have 5 books next to me because I have so many things to tell you, Frank. We just met and we have so much to catch up on.
So there, hold that up for a good long time. I love that cover, by the way. What a beautiful illustration.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, terrific. Okay, so that's a children's book, and then turn it sideways so we can just see. It's a fully illustrated book, I guess. What's it look like on the inside?
Let's look at the inside. My illustrator did a great job.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so a big, beautiful hardcover children's book called Welcome to Planet Positive. So I bring that book up in the context not just of pitching it a little bit here, but also it seems that this book grew out of your own thinking that you probably package in a completely more adult form for your clients. But I'm guessing that what is in the kids' book relates to what you're telling people in terms of how they can achieve a better and more positive outcome for themselves in terms of who they want to be. But that you're going to remember that question. I forget things, but you look.
Me too. That's why I have a big giant notebook. We're going to write that one down.
I think Ernie will die. My producer will jump in with a note saying you never went back to that other question. I want to know how you put those things together, but I also want to know something here because the kind of coaching that you're talking about seems to get into almost, besides a psychological realm, almost a spiritual realm in terms of how people look at themselves and others around them. And, the idea of telling someone with sharp elbows to behave differently and they'll get further, but when you start talking to people about being kind and caring for others around them, you're getting into the realm of almost, what you might almost call in a traditional sense, pastoral care, of giving moral advice without being moralistic. How does that fit? We'll get back to the children's book, but how does the equation of giving moral advice in terms of, look, however you want to move forward, you're going to do better if you are treating people in a certain way. In other words, have a very developed idea of what is right and wrong when it comes to personal relationships. That's got to be part of what you're doing. I don't think you'd be able to coach people in a moral vacuum. So what is your own baseline?
That's fair. It's not a moral vacuum, but I will say I'm not really giving people advice. I'm actually tapping into their resourcefulness. So I do different kinds of work. Some of the work I do is what I call positive intelligence work, which is an actual thing. There's a book on that. I have I'm not getting anything for this book, but it's a real thing. And positive intelligence is all about choosing the voice that serves you as opposed to the one that sabotages you. There are some powers in that, some actual superpowers, if you will, like creativity, connection, purpose, curiosity, action, right? So just think of those things. So I'm not telling someone how to be, but I might say, if you are more, or if you were using empathy, right, in this situation, how might that serve you and them, right?
Yes.
It's just like almost a different way to approach the world, and they have to want it. But what I would say, so if I even take a step back from that, I do this beautiful assessment called Leadership Circle. And Leadership Circle, and sometimes I do this with clients, it's like you put your arms out, both sides. If you're a leader and you have the wingspan of a leader, one is task and one is relationship. So if you are only flying with like one arm, then your reach, your power is not as great, right? So there are lots of different relationship competencies. There are lots of different, things on task. And it's about choosing, like, where do you want to grow into? Because coaching is really just creating a growing space. But what's cool and what I think will hook to some of the work that you do is that there's a core tension in like that leadership. It's creativity, and the opposite of creativity, because we're all inherently creative, is reactivity. So I work with a lot of people on how they're reacting to things, which is like being in your stress brain, right? As opposed to creating from that, transforming what's happening into something better that's working for them. And the tension there is actually around purpose, which is creativity, and safety, which is reactivity, because we're all wired to be safe, right? That's why we're not, I always say, walking in the middle of traffic and eating poisonous berries. We want to be safe. That's what we're wired for. And so, we don't want to lose our jobs. We don't want people to hate us, but that's a boring life. And so if you really want to be on purpose, you got to be at the edge of your comfort zone. It's the saying is like, there's no safe way to be great, and there's no great way to be safe. So how do you get excited, jump out of bed in the morning, like take enough risk that gets that passion going, and yet still feel like you are safe? Like, where are you on that continuum? And I just love that as a core tension in life.
Question I have for you, because you're also observing the people, I'm sure, who you're coaching and drawing your own conclusions. Every particular generation would have certain issues that might not have arisen to another generation. Then there's a kind of a baseline of reaction that all humans through all human history share. What are the peculiarities of our own moment in time in terms of the sorts of things people are facing in terms of pressure or direction that folks are working through that are, say, different than the 1970s would have been, or different than the 1940s would have been, or even different than 10 years ago? And I'm not talking about COVID. We've been there, done that. And not even particular political issues, although everything has a political edge to it. But what are the kinds of things people are facing right now that are of concern that you see a lot of, and you would therefore be able to generalize a little bit and say, look, here's something I run into quite a bit in terms of the way the world is affecting us and shaping who we are, because we don't live in a vacuum or on an island.
For sure.
What are some of the big strokes running through our culture? Forget the people you're coaching, just as an observer of life that you see happening, that folks are facing today, maybe in terms of telling people who are watching and listening to this that you're not alone if you are facing fill in the blank, because I'm seeing a lot of that.
That's right.
What are some of the pressures and things that we're all up against now that you're seeing generally running through a lot of your conversations in terms of what you're observing from your clients?
Honestly, I feel like people, just to use purpose and safety for a minute to hook to that, I think people have been traditionally expecting a very straight line of a career and a life. If I do this, then this happens, and eventually I'm going to get there. There's a destination. There's no destination anymore. And I think people have made some traditional choices for themselves to take a bigger job, to achieve at all costs, to maybe delay having a family or whatever the case may be. And they're feeling like they are lost. Like there's a feeling of not being fulfilled, not feeling happy, wondering if there's more. Like, is this it? I mean, think about how rich our life still is with everything happening, and people are feeling bored and not on purpose. There's an emptiness that I see. And I think there's a lack of, people say a lot, I want more confidence. I have a mentor coach who always says, confidence is a train that's never coming. You don't just get confidence, right? The way you grow confidence is to have the courage to be in fear of something and do it anyway. And I think I see fear stopping people more than ever. And maybe because they're pushing up against, I want to do something better. I want to do something bigger. I want to be happy, which I don't know. My parents never thought about whether they were happy.
When you're talking about do something more, are you seeing that, I'm taking it not just in the area of career, but life in general, because you talk about people delaying having families, for instance, and then waking up to the fact that maybe that, the greater business opportunity that opened up didn't pay off as they had hoped it would, or wasn't as fulfilling as it might be. When you use the term saying you're sensing a kind of an emptiness out there, go a little more into the specifics on that, and maybe even pull some examples without naming names of people and breaking confidences, but specifically, what sort of things are you talking about? Are you talking about people who have missed opportunities of relationships, family, whatever it may be? Or
yes, I have people on both sides. Like, even if we were to use relationship and family, I have women, for example, I have a woman in particular who was the most beautiful stay-at-home mom you could ever imagine, which is a tough choice, to say, hey, I'm not going to do all these other things. And then raised her kids and just really felt like, wow, who am I? Right? Who am I without all of that? And so we've gone on a journey, and she's creating her own business now at 65, at 60. And it's really remarkable. And I have some people who have chosen not to have kids and feel like I am alone. I am also getting to be almost 60, right? A client of mine, and has no idea, like, when work ends, what does life look like? So, one focused on life at the exclusion of work, and one did the opposite, focused on work at the exclusion of life, and feels like there's not, as you say, that sense of balance or, a more 360 whole view. But let's keep thinking on this. I mean, you know what, this is a good moment. Do you mind if I like parlay
Not
this
at all.
into something? So
Yeah.
the reason I know, when you were talking at the event where I met you and you struck me, and I don't think I heard anything after you said these words. You said that your life was the success, the way you viewed success in your life was by the quality of your relationships. And I just, was in awe of that, because those are types of things that I talk about in coaching. And so I parlay that to say, wow, I was so honored to even hear someone else say that, because I think like that a lot. And I'm finding that people are waking up in their own life to things like that. Like they don't have the quality of connectedness that they actually want in the world, right? They're doing the things, but they're not really internalizing it. And I'm reading this beautiful book right now by Martha Beck, who's also a coach, and it's called The Way of Integrity. And she describes it as, the word integrity really means whole or undivided. And so there's a lack of integrity in the world, but we're also experiencing a lack of integrity in ourselves. And so she uses the term, and I love this, like your true nature, right? I'm always talking about your intuition or who you truly are, but she just uses different words, the same idea. So we all have a true nature, and our mind, our heart, our bodies, our soul is giving us feedback and data on, like, is this choice good for me or not, right? We know, we tend to overlook it. So are you really following your true nature, or are you moving closer towards culture, which is the way everybody else says you should do it, the rules of like your family, your town, your country? And so many of us have moved away from our true nature and are following the culture that's where I think that emptiness comes from. It's like, wow, who am I really? So really following or having your own sense of integrity of what's right for me. Like, I'm hoping that we're coming to a place where as a people, we're raising our consciousness around those things, because that's what leads to happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah. What do you think it is in particular about our culture at this moment that makes this dichotomy between our true nature and what the culture expects of us, I guess, in the way we would define success? Because as I mentioned in my talk that you were referring to, that if your idea of success is the quality of your personal relationships, your life winds up looking very different than an idea of success simply in terms of either money or job title or this kind of thing. But what is it about the culture in particular, since the culture itself is made up of many individuals,
of course,
who also have their true natures? What has happened in our culture to make us come to the point where collectively, we push the individual away from her true nature, or in a way that individually we sort of get this, but as a culture we sort of don't get it because the culture pressure is on the other side. How do you see that working together, and where does that come from in our culture?
I don't know where that comes from. I feel like it's really more in our culture, like here in the US, than anywhere else. I just came from 10 days in Spain, and I didn't get that sense there. Like life felt very different. But I don't know, has it ever been different? I feel like we have just focused on work to the exclusion of everything else for as long as I can remember. But I don't know what's making people wonder, like, what more do they want? Maybe it's that we're living longer and we're living healthier lives, and people are living out, different plans, right? They have an act 2 and they have an act 3 now. I don't remember that happening, 20, 30 years ago in the good old days. It's like you did what you did and that's it. You kept going. And
maybe too, we've kind of thrown out the candy and eaten the wrapper, in the sense that we're always looking beyond the stuff we take for granted, personal relationships or family. Oh yeah, but in addition to that, we want these other things. if we flipped that, we would still have the careers, but we would find the satisfaction in the things that are a little closer to our true nature. I think most of us would, because I think most people, just in the way we evolved as human beings, are actually, we find more satisfaction in the quality of relationships than we do in other things. And if you move away from that, it's a problem. So when you're advising people or you're coaching them in this area, do you find pushback on that, or do folks get that when you talk about the true nature and the quality of relationships? You're saying the same sort of thing that I was in the talk that I gave. How are you putting that to people, and what is the reaction? Is there pushback, incredulity, or sort of relief?
No.
Hey, I've always thought that way, but I never heard anybody else say it. What's the reaction to that?
No, I think people they're looking for something, which is reminding me of something else. They're looking for, or they think they want something or need something extraordinarily different. But really, it's just a coming home to the basics, and it feels way more ordinary.
Yeah.
Right. And so looking at your relationships and the quality of how you're spending your time, like these are actually profound but very simple things. And it's making me, so I'm thinking of one other thing. You're going to think I'm crazy because I have all these books for you. But when I heard you say what you said, and I said to you via an email, had you ever read this book, Radical Wholeness by Phil Shepherd? It's a leadership book. It's an amazing book. It talks about very much, he feels like he has the same spirit as yours, that true wholeness is really like a connectedness to each other in our world, and that we are out of that right now. So for example, you see like famous people being whisked away in a car, like to be alone and to sit, everyone fancy lives at like the highest floor in a building. We're like removed ourselves from nature, from connectedness. And he has a line in his book that I'm telling you, I just flipped through the book the other day and saw this line, and it says, the true hero submits to ordinary being. And he talks about finding the extraordinary in life just through the ordinary, right?
Yeah,
through your relationships, through nature. And so when I read this about ordinary being, the last thing I got the opportunity to read in your book was on page 275. And it reads, this is your writing: because my ordinary days are my treat, Nora. Being with you is what I'd rather do than anything else. And my heart just did a dance, because I thought there is something similar to what you're both saying. The energy of it is like the ordinary, simple pleasures and joys are the things people are missing. That's what you're saying. That's what he's saying. It's like we're all after something, maybe just because we've been missing it for so long. And there is more.
Yeah, let me quickly interject that Nora is my youngest of 5 grandchildren. She's now 8, but when I was writing this book, she was younger, 5, 6 years old. And that came in answer to a question of hers in terms of what I wanted to do. And I was just explaining to her that she is, she was saying, you didn't do anything on your birthday. And I said, I'm with you, you are my treat. So of course, and I wasn't being sentimental, that's from the heart. But it took me a long time to get there. When I think about my relationship with my own children, who are all grown now, there were times when I was on the road and away from home for 6 months of the year. And if I had that to do over again, I would have changed that. And then I kind of learned a little bit along the way and would start bringing them with me more when I was making films and this kind of a thing. Only in taking care of my 3 youngest grandchildren, that is the context of that book, did it finally dawn on me that if I was going to make compromises or sacrifices in one direction or another, what I really wanted was more time with them, and have been much more satisfied since then. Feel less torn, and I think a lot of folks eventually come to the understanding that the people in their life, their primary relationships, are really what makes them happiest, even in the most selfish sense of the word. Which is maybe a kind of a no-brainer moment, but yeah. It's crazy that we're living in a culture that you have to kind of work through a whole bunch of other options before you finally get there.
You're making me also think, based on your last question, of sort of a new cultural norm is that people are so interconnected now with technology being as is. You can work anywhere, you can move anywhere.
Sure.
Families aren't living together. You live across the street from your grandkids. That's amazing. But if we're not growing up that way, where we're all caring for each other, it's just not in our nature. And so think we're just more in solitude because we're not living with families the way we did so many generations ago. It's not
Well,
an
and
intergenerational, community.
And you see all these horrifying statistics about loneliness, that has been charted by people for generations now in terms of polling and studies. And I don't think anybody argues that people are not more lonely now than they've ever been in our recorded modern history. I mean, this is a thing. And what's amazing is all these young people with their phones who are, quote, connected to everybody, they rate loneliest of all.
Yes. Yeah. And they say New York City is one of the loneliest places. I mean, this is a big city of, 10 million people, something like that.
Yeah. So when in terms of, talk a little more about the welcome to Planet Positive.
Planet Positive.
Yeah. And what the book is actually about. And let's go there a little more.
Okay.
People feeling of what that is and the age group that you wrote it for. And let's dive into the book a little bit.
Let's dive into the book a little bit. So this book was written, really, I was inspired by my son, who did something very hard. I will just say, for your listeners' sake, he applied to a fancy school in the midst of COVID, a private school. We go to public school here in Rye. And it was something he's very academic and it's something he really wanted. You see your kid going through something and working really hard for something.
Right.
And by no fault of his own, he didn't get in. Doesn't mean he's not smart enough to get in. It was just like the year, too many people were doing it, but he was crestfallen, heartbroken for, when he first found out, and he was maybe 10 at the time, a couple of years back. And I was also feeling that for him. And amidst these moments, I told him a story called the farmer story. It's also referred to in positive intelligence as the stallion story. You can look it up. It's a Taoist story, an ancient story. And it kind of goes something like this. I'll give you the flavor. It's like there's this farmer and he has a stallion and a stallion wins first prize. And so the whole village is like, they're so excited, for the farmer. And the farmer's like, maybe, like, who knows what's actually good and what's bad. And then the stallion runs away. And so the whole town is so sad and so sorry for the farmer. And he has the same response, like, I don't know, maybe, who knows what's good or what's bad. The stallion comes back and he actually brings with it some mares. And so everyone's really excited and same thing happens. And the farmer's like, I don't know, who knows what's good or what's bad. And the farmer's son jumps on the stallion and takes it for a ride and falls off and breaks his leg. So now the whole town's like, okay, like this is so bad, right? Farmer the same is like, who knows what's good or what's bad. And the next day, the army walks around to collect the boys who could fight in a war. And they can't take the boy because he broke his leg on the stallion. And so, of course, now everyone's chanting and gets that the perspective of that story is like we make up in life whether something's good or bad, but we don't know what that next thing is 3, steps down. And so how do we hold the perspective that anything that happens to us can really be, any challenge can be turned into a gift or an opportunity because you don't know what else you'll encounter along the way. So I told this story to my son, a slightly shorter version, and he came back and he basically said, he went to soccer practice, brokenhearted. He came back, he said, Mom, I thought about your long story and I have decided that I'm not going to let this thing get me down. And like his whole energy shifted. And I was so impressed by him and so inspired that I woke up the next morning as if something pulled me out of bed. And I just decided I'm going to write a book about the inspiration that he just gave me by really adopting that perspective, letting children know everywhere. And I'm going to have him help me do it, that you can choose the voice that you hold in your head. That's the way you see the world. That's yours to choose. And I was so driven to do this. Beyond really what I could describe, that I never stopped to say, should I do this? I've never done this before. How do I do this? Is it a good idea? Like I didn't have the self-limiting voices because I was so in purpose. I was so like, I'm just seeing the end. I wanted it more than I feared it, more than I worried about it. I didn't worry or fear at all. I just did it, but I did it on behalf really of him. And I often find, I try to get my clients to think about what's the bigger thing they're serving. Because if you do something just for yourself, but if you do something on behalf of someone else, that's really when you're on purpose, on fire. So anyway,
I love that.
I was
that's a great story about a story. What is the age that your book, who do you picture as the reader in terms of the child?
Yeah, it's really like first grade to third grade is the sweet spot. However, he was in fifth grade when we wrote this together. I think you can be older. Parents say, oh, wow, I've had someone 75 call me and say, this was a great book for my family because we kind of needed that in a simple way. But I think the reading of it to someone, it really could be K through 5. But I think first grade through third grade, you could read it yourself.
And like all good books that have true things in them, I'm sure sometimes somebody who's 70 years old like me would come to it and say, hey, I really like this because I find sometimes children, quote unquote, children's books are the ones I get a great deal from when I'm reading to my grandchildren and so forth. I'm reminded when you talked about that story, that looking back at my own life in terms of this idea that what defines me, but also where I find the greatest joy is in the quality of the interpersonal relationships. And that's really where it's at. Everything else is it's not even on the same page. It's not like you balance these things. That is the program. And then there's all this other stuff that you do to continue that happening. I look back at my own life just to go personal for a minute, and something that I never would have foreseen when I was in my 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever it may be, but I see very clearly now as I head into my 70s, is that literally what I'm most thankful for now in looking back, along with the fact that I met Jeannie and had these children and all this stuff, is the utter failure of some of my best laid plans. Speaking of the horse and breaking your leg, because the things that I value most now and things that have worked out best for my children, my family, my relationships, but even just on the material side of life, where you live, this kind of thing, would have been derailed at some point had things that I at the time thought, I really wanted more than anything else.
Yeah.
Worked out as I was hoping they did.
That's
and
right.
At the time when they went down in flames, if you had asked me, 30 years from now, are you going to look back and be so thankful that right now you're sitting in the living room with your head buried in your hands, wondering how you're going to proceed now because this thing's just blown up that you spent 3 years putting together? I would not have believed you. But actually now, as I look back at my own life, it's the doors that shut that allowed me to find things that I wouldn't have if I had gotten my way. I don't know if that's typical of other people, but it certainly has been in my life. I mean,
so beautifully said. I do. So beautifully said. And that's really the road to trusting yourself. See, you don't even need, you could be a coach. It's the road to trusting yourself and trusting the timing of your life, which when people just take a minute to even pretend that they could do that, they feel a lightness that they haven't felt before. And so I think it's a beautiful way to think about it, right? Each life is a chapter, and imagine that the book is going to come together the way it's supposed to.
Yeah.
Like let each thing be its thing and not control every single piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel that often about the place one lives or all sorts of other things. The time you think, oh, I have to be in such and such a place, and then it doesn't work out. And 10 years later, you look back and say, thank God that didn't work out.
Right. Right. Well, people think they want certainty in the moment. And so when we have particular outcomes and we drive only towards those outcomes, we miss the magic of the beauty of the unknown and things that might surprise us along the way.
Well, often what's right in front of you. You want this big fancy thing, but the thing that you're actually 15 years later, what you're going to remember and treasure isn't that big fancy thing. It was right in front of you.
It's the ordinary thing right there. It's just
I love the ordinary, this emphasis on the ordinary. So we will wrap that up. Let's just say once again, I have been talking with Susan Ross, who's a life coach. Susan, we're going to post how people get in touch with you. And how do you like to be contacted? Because Ernie, my wonderful producer, will put that link everywhere. We will also put the link to your book on Amazon or wherever else you want us to do that. So people can get the book, they can get in touch with you, they can do whatever. What aren't we remembering here?
I love that. That's all good. So intentiongroup.com is my website. People can email me directly, right? They can email me directly. They can find me on their site. They can Instagram me or LinkedIn me.
Sure.
I encourage people to do that, right? Like I love to be connected like you with more people.
Yeah.
So no, I would appreciate that. And Ernie is the best.
Well, Ernie will put that everywhere.
You,
we will. Yes. Thank you, Ernie, as ever. We will put links to your book. And Susan, it's been a real pleasure. Welcome to Planet Positive is the book. Intention Personal Development Group is the company or the work or whatever you want to call it, your life vocation. This has been a really lovely conversation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Frank. It's my privilege.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Take care.